In 1910, on a residential street in Atlanta, Georgia, a mansion appeared that had no reasonable explanation by the standards of its time. 15 rooms, Beaux-Arts facade, a portico carried by classical columns rising from a stone foundation. The elevation placed the house above street level, so that approaching it required ascending stairs, a detail that architects understand and clients request deliberately. The exterior was dressed stone, not wood, not brick veneer, but cut and fitted masonry that communicated permanence in a language that any American city in 1910 would have recognized as the vocabulary of wealth. The interior held marble floors, carved woodwork, stained glass, and formal rooms scaled for events rather than for daily life. The house had been built by black craftsmen, occupied by a black family, and situated in a city where black residents had been systematically excluded from every institution that was supposed to generate the kind of fortune such a house required. In 1910, while America's industrial barons were completing marble palaces in Newport and Manhattan, a man born into slavery finished a mansion in Atlanta that rivaled their ambition in craft and exceeded their circumstances in meaning. The house did not go unnoticed. In a city whose racial architecture was enforced not only by law, but by the daily performance of social distance, a structure of this scale and quality was impossible to misread. Wealthy white Atlanta had constructed its own domestic monuments in neighborhoods from which black residents were excluded by deed restriction and social consensus. Those estates communicated a claim on the city, on its future, on the legitimacy of the families inside them. The Herndon Mansion made that same statement from a different address. What made this house different was not simply its size. Plenty of large buildings had been constructed in Atlanta by 1910. What made it different was the identity of its owner, the source of its financing, and the precision with which it demonstrated that black capital, accumulated through legal means and reinvested through disciplined strategy, could produce results that the prevailing social order had declared impossible. The threat was not architectural. The reaction came quietly. But the house itself stood as a statement that could not be edited, painted over, or politely ignored. Understanding the mansion requires understanding the man who built it, and understanding the man requires beginning at a point as far from Beaux-Arts columns as the American South could produce. Alonzo Franklin Herndon was born in Social Circle, Walton County, Georgia, in 1858. His mother, Sophony, was an enslaved woman. His father was Frank Herndon, the white man who enslaved her. This parentage gave Alonzo Herndon nothing in the way of inheritance, and less than nothing in the way of legal status. He was born property. When emancipation came with the end of the Civil War, Herndon was 7 years old. What he inherited from freedom was the same thing every formerly enslaved person in Georgia inherited: his own labor and whatever he could make from it. In the postbellum South, the range of economic activity available to a black man without capital, without education, and without political protection was narrow. Sharecropping captured most of the formerly enslaved population in arrangements that replicated the economic dependency of slavery without its legal name. Herndon worked as a farm laborer, as a domestic worker, and eventually found his way to barbering, which occupied a particular economic position in the South that is worth understanding precisely. White clientele in southern cities required personal service, and certain forms of personal service were racially coded as appropriate for black providers. Barbering was one of them. A black barber serving white clients was inside the system of racial hierarchy, providing a service that reinforced the social distance between the man in the chair and the man holding the razor, while simultaneously receiving payment that passed from white capital into black hands. Herndon understood this dynamic and used it. He arrived in Atlanta in 1878. By 1882, he had accumulated enough capital to open his own shop. By the 1890s, he was operating on Peachtree Street. He operated on the primary commercial artery of white Atlanta, in premises that were designed to meet the expectations of the city's most affluent white clientele. His flagship establishment on Peachtree Street was fitted with imported fixtures, attended by trained staff, and offered a level of service that positioned it as a destination rather than merely a convenience. Senators came. Businessmen came. The commercial elite of a rapidly growing New South City sat in Alonzo Herndon's chairs and paid Alonzo Herndon's prices, and through that transaction, money moved. It moved in a direction the city had not fully accounted for. Herndon's barbershops generated revenue that he did not spend on the lifestyle expectations of his social position. He saved. He invested in real estate at a time when Atlanta's growth was converting land values rapidly. He purchased properties, held them, and sold them when appreciation warranted. The compounding logic of real estate investment in a growing city applied to Herndon's holdings the same way it applied to white investors, with the significant constraint that the geography available to him was restricted by the racial architecture of the city. He worked within that constraint and produced results in spite of it. Money accumulates quietly. Mansions announce themselves. But before the mansion came the institution that made the mansion possible in a different way than the barbershops had. In 1905, Herndon purchased the Atlanta Mutual Aid Association, a small benevolent society that was technically in the insurance business and practically struggling to remain solvent. He paid $140 for it. That price, relative to what the institution would become, is one of the more consequential transactions in the history of American black enterprise. Herndon brought capital, organizational discipline, and business relationships to the association, restructured its operations, expanded its product offerings, and renamed it Atlanta Life Insurance Company. The insurance business in the black community of the early 20th century was not simply a financial product. It was an infrastructure of survival. White-owned insurance companies either refused to write policies on black lives or charged rates that reflected discrimination rather than actuarial calculation. Black families who wanted the protection of a life insurance policy or burial insurance, which was the entry-level product that reached deepest into working-class communities, had to find it from institutions willing to serve them. Atlanta Life became one of those institutions and grew into the largest black-owned insurance company in the United States. By the time of Herndon's death in 1927, Atlanta Life held assets that historians and contemporaries estimated at more than $1 million, a figure that translates into a substantially larger sum by any modern comparison that accounts for a century of inflation. The insurance company did what the barbershops had done, but at larger scale and with more durable effect. It generated income. It generated assets. It generated the kind of institutional financial weight that could be leveraged, reinvested, and compounded across time. And it generated, by 1910, the financial foundation for something that Herndon had apparently been planning for years. He commissioned a mansion. The house that Alonzo Herndon built at 655 University Place Northwest in Atlanta was completed in 1910. It was designed in the Beaux-Arts manner, which was the dominant architectural language of American elite domestic construction in the Gilded Age. Beaux-Arts drew from classical Greek and Roman forms, filtered through the French academic tradition that trained most of America's leading architects at the turn of the century. Its visual signatures were symmetry, columns, elaborate stone ornamentation, rusticated base courses, and the deliberate evocation of European palatial architecture applied to the private residence. When the Vanderbilts wanted to signal that they occupied a position equivalent to European aristocracy, they built Beaux-Arts. When Alonzo Herndon wanted to build a house that occupied the architectural vocabulary of American elite aspiration, he chose the same language. The mansion's facade presented a portico with classical columns that framed the main entrance. The columns rose to a full second story, creating the visual effect of elevation and grandeur that the style demanded. The stone exterior communicated, as intended, that this was not a building expected to be replaced. The foundation was deep. The materials were not provisional. The construction, carried out by black craftsmen, recruited and directed for the project, produced a result that Herndon and his wife Adrienne McNeil Herndon oversaw with specific attention to quality at every stage. Adrienne McNeil Herndon deserves particular attention in the context of the house's design. She was a professor of drama and elocution at Atlanta University, a woman of considerable education and social standing within Atlanta's black intellectual community. She brought to the mansion project an aesthetic sensibility and an understanding of how formal space functions socially that shaped the interior's design in ways that went beyond mere expenditure. The interior rooms were not simply large. They were arranged and appointed for purpose. The formal parlors were for reception. The dining room was scaled for the kind of entertainment that signals social standing across cultures and centuries. The library reflected the intellectual character of a household where books and ideas were taken seriously. The interior materials were selected for permanence and quality. Marble appeared in the floors and in architectural details. Carved woodwork detailed the mantels, the banisters, and the millwork throughout the house. Stained glass admitted light in ways that transformed the ordinary act of walking through a room into an encounter with color and craftsmanship. These were not decorative gestures applied to a functional structure. They were integral to a house designed from the foundation upward to communicate what the Herndon family had built and intended to continue building. The mansion had 15 rooms across its floors. That count includes formal rooms on the ground floor, private rooms on the upper floor, and service spaces that reflect the staffed household that the Herndons maintained. The scale of domestic staffing in a house like this one was itself a statement of economic position. To employ domestic workers to maintain a formal household at the level the mansion's design required was to occupy a stratum of American wealth that most Americans of any racial background never reached. Comparison to the estates of the Gilded Age elite requires care, because the fortunes of men like William Henry Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, or J.P. Morgan operated at a scale that dwarfs almost any individual fortune of the period. Morgan's estimated wealth at his death in 1913 was in the range of $80 million, which provoked John D. Rockefeller's famous observation that Morgan had not been particularly rich after all. Vanderbilt's mansion at Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, which was completed in 1895, covered over 4 acres of floor space and contained 250 rooms. The Newport cottages of the Vanderbilt family required staffs of dozens of servants to operate and consumed construction budgets that ran into millions of dollars at a time when $1 million was a genuinely significant sum. Herndon's mansion does not compete with these structures on the basis of scale or cost. What makes the comparison meaningful is the ratio of the house to the constraints under which it was produced. The Vanderbilts built in a country that was organized to facilitate the accumulation of their kind of wealth. The legal systems, the banking systems, the political systems, and the social systems of the United States in the Gilded Age were not perfectly aligned with the interests of industrial capital, but they were not systematically opposed to it either. Vanderbilt did not need to navigate a social order that had spent decades designing mechanisms to prevent him from accumulating capital. Herndon did. The mansion he produced under those conditions is not a smaller version of Biltmore. It is a different kind of achievement. The house at University Place functioned as more than a residence. It was a site of civic and social life for Atlanta's black professional class in ways that the racial geography of the city made necessary. Atlanta's white social institutions were closed to black Atlantans regardless of their wealth, their education, or their professional standing. The clubs, the hotels, the event spaces where white Atlanta's elite conducted the social rituals of their class were simply unavailable. Black Atlanta's elite, therefore, conducted their social rituals in the spaces available to them, and in 1910, Atlanta, one of the most significant such spaces was the Herndon Mansion. Social gatherings at the house brought together the professional and intellectual leadership of Atlanta's black community. Atlanta University faculty and administrators, who formed one of the most significant concentrations of black academic talent in the country at that time, moved through the Herndon household. The civic networks, organized by figures like John Wesley Dobbs, who would spend decades building the infrastructure of black political organization in Georgia, intersected with the economic networks that the Herndons represented. The house was, in a practical sense, a headquarters for a community conducting its business and its politics without access to the institutional infrastructure that white Atlanta took for granted. This function gave the mansion a significance that extended beyond its architectural statement. It was not only a symbol of what black capital could produce, it was an operating center for the black elite's effort to build and sustain the institutions that would allow that capital to persist across time. The mansion survived. The financial ecosystem around it did not survive intact. Atlanta's racial geography in the years after the mansion's completion was not static. The Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906, which preceded the mansion's completion by 4 years, had demonstrated the capacity of white mob violence to attack black economic institutions directly. That attack had failed to eliminate black Atlanta's economic class, which rebuilt and continued. But the social pressure on black economic success operated on multiple tracks simultaneously, and not all of them were as visible as a riot. Alonzo Herndon occupied a specific and uncomfortable position within Atlanta's racial order. His wealth was real. His property was documented. His insurance company employed staff, paid claims, and generated revenue that placed it among the significant financial institutions in the city by any objective measure. And none of that translated into political standing, legal protection, or social recognition from the white institutions that controlled the city's governance, its courts, and its police. A white industrialist of comparable financial standing would have had access to Atlanta's political class, to its civic institutions, and to the informal networks of influence through which business decisions, city contracts, and legal determinations were actually made. Herndon had access to none of that, because the mechanisms of access were controlled by a system that defined his racial identity as grounds for exclusion. The Rockefellers expanded because the structures around them were designed to accommodate expansion. The Standard Oil monopoly operated under hostile federal scrutiny and was eventually broken up by the Supreme Court in 1911. But the legal and political systems that engaged with Rockefeller were engaging with him as a participant in those systems, not as someone whose participation was itself the problem. Black economic elites in Atlanta were constrained not by regulatory scrutiny of their business practices, but by the systematic denial of the conditions that would have allowed those practices to produce comparable results. The credit markets that financed Gilded Age industrial expansion were not available on equal terms. The political representation that could have protected black economic interests from hostile legislation was suppressed by poll taxes, white primaries, and organized intimidation. The social legitimacy that converts private wealth into civic influence was withheld by the racial codes that white Atlanta maintained as social infrastructure. The mansion stood in that context as an anomaly that the system had not fully accounted for. It was too permanent to ignore and too costly to destroy without consequences that even the racial order of 1910 Atlanta would have found awkward to explain. So it stood. And the Herndons continued to occupy it, to host in it, to use it as the operating center of a life that the city around them was not organized to support. Alonzo Herndon died on July 21, 1927, in the house he had built. His death came before the catastrophic economic events of the following years, which might be considered a form of mercy for a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing financial institutions under conditions designed to prevent their existence. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and struck black financial institutions with particular force. The structural fragility of black-owned banks, which had been operating without access to the correspondent banking networks and federal credit facilities that allowed white-owned banks to weather contractions, produced a wave of failures that wiped out the savings of depositors who had placed their money in institutions that were themselves the products of exclusion from the mainstream banking system. The National Negro Business League had documented more than 100 black-owned banks operating in the United States at the beginning of the 1920s. By the middle of the 1930s, that number had collapsed to a fraction of its former count. Atlanta Life Insurance survived. The institution that Herndon had built in 1905 was structurally positioned to weather the Depression better than many black financial institutions because insurance reserves operate on different principles than bank deposits, and because Atlanta Life had reached a scale of operation that gave it more resources to draw on in a contraction. The survival of Atlanta Life across the Depression decade was not incidental. It was the product of the institutional design that Herndon had applied to it, and the management that followed him. But the broader ecosystem of black financial institutions in Atlanta did not emerge from the Depression intact. The banks that had provided credit to black businesses, the investment networks that had allowed black real estate holders to leverage their properties, and the financial infrastructure that had supported the commercial density of Auburn Avenue at its peak were significantly reduced. The Depression accelerated a process of financial consolidation that had already been underway, and the institutions that were operating at the margins of the financial system were the ones that disappeared. The mansion itself passed from private residence to institutional property. Norris Herndon, Alonzo's son, who inherited both the house and the leadership of Atlanta Life, maintained the mansion and eventually transferred it to the Herndon Foundation. It was preserved, restored, and open to the public as a historic house museum. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and designated a National Historic Landmark, a federal designation reserved for properties with exceptional national significance. The current state of the Herndon Mansion is well maintained and accessible. Visitors can walk through the rooms where Alonzo and Adrian Herndon hosted the intellectual and civic leadership of Black Atlanta, where the decisions that shaped Atlanta Life Insurance were discussed, and where the material evidence of what black capital accumulation could produce in the age of formal segregation was assembled room by room and stone by stone. What they see is not the largest house ever built in Atlanta. It is not the most expensive. It is not the most architecturally complex. By the measures applied to Gilded Age estates, it occupies a modest position. By the measure of what it required to build it, there is no comparable residential structure in the city's history. The mansion still stands, not as a rival to America's Gilded Age elite, but as evidence that it once was.